Hello and welcome to another video from the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we are going to be looking at one of the anthology poems from the Power and Conflict cluster of the anthology, and we're going to be exploring London by William Blake. If you're thinking of your exam, this is going to help you prepare for your English Literature Paper 2, Section B. Let's start by having a look at London, the poem as a whole. This poem, just remember, was published in 1794. So we're in a historical period called the Georgian period. And it was a time of poverty in London, rife child labour, very high death rates due to malnutrition. The Industrial Revolution was taking place in London, and general oppression and suffering in the city. Do feel free to pause the video after I've read it through once so that you can read it through a few more times on your own. London by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay, pause the video there and read the poem through once or twice more by yourself. Right, the first thing we'll do in terms of exploring the poem then is we'll look at some of William Blake's, so the poet's, key ideas and concepts and messages really for the reader that he wanted to convey through the poem. So first and foremost, he wanted to present the city of London as a place of great hardship and struggle. As I mentioned, contextually, at the time that William Blake was alive and living and working in the city and writing his poem, it was a time of great oppression of the poor, of child poverty, of poverty in general for large parts of the population, of overcrowding, pollution. Was getting worse because of the factories that were ever increasing because of the Industrial Revolution. The working conditions were often very, very poor and led people to become ill and injured, and often working for low wages as well. Then another key message and concept is the idea that those in power, so those who perhaps are rich or in control, should be helping the most vulnerable, so the poorest, those living in poverty, or the youngest in society. But they are actually the ones to blame for the suffering. Rather than preventing suffering and hardship, they're actually perpetuating it, and they're the cause of it. Perhaps through the second and the fourth stanzas, the infant's cry of fear, the youthful harlot's curse, the newborn infant's tear, and the marriage hearse, Blake wanted to convey the idea that the innocent, the most innocent, so the young perhaps, and the most happy, or the things that should be most happy, such as marriage, start of a new life together, can actually be turned into or forced into a life of misery and immorality within the city of London due to the suffering and the desperation. Another key idea is that even nature is corrupted in the city. So alongside the innocent becoming corrupted, even something natural like the River Thames is corrupted and rented out and given over to business and a way of making money. And that corruption comes as a result of man. Moving on, one key idea perhaps is that people could escape oppression if they were able to think differently. in terms of being able to think differently, if they were given the ability, the education to think differently. So I don't think Blake is criticising those in poverty themselves, but the idea that maybe freedom from poverty and from destitution could be achieved if people were able to take on a new perspective of the way that they're being treated and the way that society should be run. And that comes through these mind-forged manacles, that actually not only physical oppression is rife in the city, but mental oppression, the way people have been led to think, and a lack of education, a lack of freedom of thought, perhaps for the powerless and the poor. And then finally, a key concept is the powerless suffer as a result of the abuse of power of these powerful institutions such as the church and the monarchy. Those who should be helping and alleviating the suffering and the destitution are actually abusing their power and causing the suffering. Let's move on and explore the poem in a bit more detail, looking at some of the methods that Blake uses to convey some of his key ideas and opinions on the city. So we start with the lines, "I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames flow." Now, the repetition of this adjective chartered is really important. The word chartered means one of a few things: mapped out or legally defined, or it can mean rented or given over to business. And to suggest that the streets are chartered, and even the River Thames, the river that flows through London, is chartered, it suggests that every part of the city is controlled, mapped out, owned by somebody powerful, and used for financial gain by man. So for profit and for exploitation. We also hear "I wandered through." That pronoun "I" is repeated throughout, and we know that therefore that we are listening to a personal journey through a first-person narrative perspective. We do know that at the time the poem was published in 1794, Blake was living and working in London, and therefore we can safely assume that he is the speaker of the poem, and that he takes this personal journey often through London, and this is what he sees as an individual. We have another example of repetition in the first and second stanzas. He marks, so he observes in every face he meets marks of weakness. He hears every cry of every man, every infant's cry of fear, every voice. You know, the repetition of that word "every" reveals that nobody in London escapes the misery and the struggle that the city causes. Now, in terms of what he sees, at the end of that first stanza, he observes, he marks in every face he meets, he sees marks of weakness and marks of woe. And those two abstract nouns are really powerful, and they communicate the real vulnerability and the sorrow of the people in London. And we have, through marks of weakness and marks of woe, like a physical manifestation of their struggle and their poverty, that you can actually see it physically in their faces. And then moving on into that second stanza, we've got really vivid auditory imagery of the crying and the fear in every cry of the infant and every voice. And it makes the suffering of the people of London really vivid and distressing for the reader. And again, that repetition of crying emphasises how the suffering and the sorrow of the people of London is relentless and ongoing. At the end of the second stanza, Blake seems to hint at one of the reasons why the people are so oppressed and living in hardship in London. And he refers to the metaphor mind-forged manacles. Now, manacles are handcuffed, so they'd be used at the time to maybe keep prisoners trapped and unable to escape. Or maybe manacles would be used to inflict some pain. And that metaphor really suggests that the the thing that's keeping the people of London trapped and oppressed is actually a lot to do with the way they're thinking, the mental approach to how they live. He's not particularly criticising the people for that. The way that they, have had a lack of education perhaps has led them to be not able to think of society in any different way, to not be able to break out of that oppression and that suffering that they're experiencing, because they have no way of thinking about society in any different way, of perceiving a change in society perhaps. Maybe those people are trapped by their own thoughts that, that have been caused by the more powerful, that have been oppressed, that have been impressed on them. But if perhaps people could find a new way of thinking, perhaps they could break free of the tyranny of the powerful in London and perhaps experience a certain freedom. In the third stanza, he refers to the institution of the church. Now, the church as an institution, as an organisation, should be seen as holy, compassionate and kind. But this oxymoron, blackening church, suggests that it's actually becoming more corrupt and immoral. So adjective blackening, becoming blacker, maybe suggests that it's becoming ever more sinful. And rather than providing help and support for the most vulnerable in society, as the church should do, it's actually perpetuating the suffering by not helping, by turning a blind eye and becoming very ignorant towards the suffering of the most vulnerable. And it's, that's a real failure in Blake's mind, and he's really critical there. Of course, blackening as well could perhaps, as an alternative interpretation, be referring to the ever increasing pollution in the city due to the Industrial Revolution, and how everything became tainted with this really gloomy black because of the smog and the pollution from the factories. In this stanza as well, in stanza 3, we have a reference to the blood running down palace walls. Now there's a combination of images and figurative language here. Blake says that the hapless soldiers sigh, so that idea of sighing, becoming quite hopeless and despondent, and that's interesting because soldiers are usually very purposeful and well respected, strong. That their sighing runs in blood down palace walls. So their sorrow and their despondency and the fact that the soldiers are so distraught and they're sighing is the fault of the monarchy, is the fault of the most powerful. And that sadness and suffering and weakness of people like soldiers who've fought for their country is actually the fault of the monarchy, and they are to blame for their suffering. Symbol of guilt, obviously, through that blood as well, is really, really powerful. The running of the blood down palace walls could be an allusion to the French Revolution as well, perhaps, which took place in 1789, so just 5 years before this poem was published. Perhaps we might perceive that as Blake being sympathetic to the French Revolution when we combine it with that image of the mind-forged manacles, that metaphorical image, suggesting that actually maybe if people broke out of this way of thinking, like he maybe thought the French did, and overthrew the monarchy, that a new way of living in society could be established, and people's freedom and breaking away from oppression could be achieved. And then this final stanza, we've got quite a few uses of juxtaposition again. So we've got the juxtaposition, the contrast between the youthful and the harlot. So youthful, a time of childhood, innocence, and that carefree time of life, contrasted with the idea of harlot, so prostitutes. So those forced into maybe a life of corruption and sadness and exploitation. Maybe it suggests that even the most pure and the most innocent can be forced into that life of immorality if they're desperate enough and if they don't have that support and that love that childhood should allow them. We've also got juxtaposition of moments of happiness, so the newborn baby, the newborn infant, and the marriage is blasted with curses and is plagued with disease, with blights, and also at risk of being carted away in a hearse, which at the time would be the carriage that took the coffin away. And the juxtaposition of the happy and the grief-stricken and the sorrow there suggests that even the moments of most happiness and most contentment are tainted with sorrow and grief and death in London. There is no happiness to be found. That semantic field, as I mentioned, of illness and disease through those words blights and plagues suggests that actually, like a disease, the hardship and the suffering of the poorest in London is uncontrollable and extremely harmful to the population of the city. And then finally, just a comment on the structure of the poem. Throughout, we've got a really regular rhyme scheme. So we've got A-B rhyme scheme. So that means that the first and the third lines rhyme, and the second and the fourth lines of each stanza rhyme. We've also got a really regular iambic metre. So you might recognise that word iambic from Shakespeare's playwriting. And it's where we have each line having an unstressed, then a stressed syllable, then an unstressed, then a stressed syllable, then an unstressed, and so on. So I wander through each chart. So unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And that's what we call an iambic metre. And that's really quite relentless, along with that rhyme scheme throughout, which perhaps mirrors the relentless nature of the suffering that the speaker, that Blake, encounters as he journeys around London, and of course the unvarying hardship of the poorest and the powerless at the hands of the powerful in the city. Let's start by reading through the poem. Tissue by Imtiaz Darker. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching. The kind you find in well-used books. The back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date. Pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers, over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked, and thin to be transparent, turned into your skin.